Continuing from the previous lesson, we'll now start to refine our radiosity results. Alright, so this is where we left off in our previous lesson. So overall, not off to a bad start, but definitely a lot of room for improvement as far as this radiosity result is concerned. So let's start by taking a look at the render setup. Let's go over to the Advanced Lighting tab, and we want to take a look inside some of these different radiosity parameters that we have. So looking down through this, some things that can start to help improve the overall result. We have the refinement. So as this radiosity solution is calculated, it can start to be run through a couple of refinement processes just to kind of help smooth things out and help eliminate noise and speckles and things like that. So I always try to make it a point to at least give it a couple of iterations for refinement. Now when it comes to doing indirect and direct light filtering, it does kind of help to, again, soften out some of this noise. Now these will become a little bit more apparent once we actually start to get a little bit better subdivision in these areas. So let's scroll down, and underneath this radiosity meshing parameters rollout, we should see an option for global subdivision settings. Now when we turn this on, we also have the ability to use adaptive subdivision. Now this is what we want. So what Max will now do is during this radiosity calculation, it will automatically decide where it needs to add more vertices in order to store more color information. So a lot of times this will happen in areas of high contrast. Now this area of contrast can be defined by this contrast threshold. So a higher threshold means it's going to be less likely to add these vertices in some of these high contrast areas. A lower value means it'll be more likely to add some of these extra vertices. So I always try to lower this value a little bit more. Now on this maximum mesh size, really just kind of refers to the largest triangles that are going to be delivered to you as a result of this radiosity calculation and this subdivision. So right now it's set to about 0.9 meters, which if you compare that to the overall size of our grid, that's a pretty good size. Now we may need to adjust this, but we'll leave this as it is for now, just for demonstration's sake. Now I might need to come in and actually lower this minimum mesh size because, again, compared to my grid, this is maybe a little bit on the large side. So let's maybe drop this down to about 0.02 meters. Alright, and now let's see what this does for us. So let's scroll up and reprocess the radiosity. Alright, and here's the result of our radiosity solution. Now you may run into a problem where when you try to update, it may actually refuse to update the radiosity. It may just say that the result is invalid at the current frame. Now in that situation, you may have to turn on this checkbox that says update data when required. Now from that point, once you update, it'll reread all the different geometry in your scene and then give you the appropriate results. Alright, so I'm going to press F4 again to view the result. So you can see that it's gone in and selectively added the geometry in the areas where we have these high levels of contrast, specifically around some of these bright areas and around the chair, some of these other areas, and has now stored this indirect illumination data in those vertices. Alright, so I could actually come back to my render settings, and let's take a look at this. Let's go back to the Advanced Lighting tab. If we turn on the filtering, let's maybe filter the indirect results. You can see how that kind of helps smooth some of this stuff out. There we go, just kind of softens those results a little bit more. Alright, so let's now compare our render. Let's go ahead and re-render this. Alright, so here's the result that we get. Now right now you may see that maybe things are a little bit blown out, maybe a little bit more washed out than what you'd like. So we could probably come in and actually just alter the exposure controls to get the result that we want. So let's maybe just render out a preview image real quick. Alright, and maybe just start to take down some of these different contrast levels, maybe start to increase the contrast, maybe bring down some of this brightness just a little bit, maybe alter some of these midtones just to kind of bring a little bit more contrast into the scene. All right, we'll see what that does for us. Alright, so there we go. That's a subtle difference, but it does start to bring a little bit more darkness into some of these shadowed areas. Alright, now one thing that you will notice definitely is that there are some blotchy areas to have to be taken care of. So this can be done, or rather alleviated, in a couple of different ways. So if we go back to our render settings, back to the Advanced tab, we could start to increase this filtering a little bit more, so we could start to bump up these steps a little bit more. But more than likely what we'll have to do is actually use some regathering methods for this. Now if we scroll down a little bit further, let's take a look inside the rendering parameters. So in this case, let's start to now regather the indirect illumination. So now what we'll do is at render time actually start to regather and recalculate some of this radiosity and hopefully start to smooth out our results a little bit more. Alright, so let's see what we get now. Alright, so you can see overall it has eliminated some of the kind of unusual noise that we had, but it's now introduced a little different kind of noise as a result of this regathering. So what we'll need to do is probably increase this filter radius. Let's maybe try something like a 10 pixel radius. And while we're at it, just to kind of keep things nice and sharp, maybe try to drop this filtering level back down. Maybe start to sharpen some of these areas back up. Alright, so now we're starting to get a little bit closer to our end result. So let's now maybe start to kind of put some final touches on this. So once we're finished, we need to come in and possibly reset this calculation so that way we can start to increase the percentage of this. So let's bump this up to about a 90% quality. Alright, and let's see what this does for us. Let's just restart the calculation. Alright, so now that we have this set up to a little bit higher quality, obviously now this radiosity solution is going to take a little bit longer to calculate. But now we should now start to see a little bit more detail that it begins to appear. Alright, so you can see now that we've got a little bit cleaner solution as far as the backs of these shelves go, so we got a little bit more detail back in here. Now we could probably start to maybe increase this just a little bit more by maybe starting to come in and increasing these number of rays. So let's maybe try a small area, maybe right down in here for this regathering effect, because you can start to see that we've actually lost quite a bit of detail when you compare what we have in the viewport to what we have back here, especially along these floorboards. We've lost quite a bit of this darkness. So let's see what we can do about that. Alright, so that's a little bit better. Starting to get now a little bit more of this darkness included in here. So let's come back to the view, and let's maybe actually alter some of these exposure controls just a little bit more. You can see overall that this image is a little bit on the muted side, so let's see what we can do to maybe come back and make some minor alterations to this. We'll come back and re-render this little thumbnail preview. Alright, so let's maybe start by maybe bringing some of this contrast up a little bit higher. And maybe start to increase this brightness and maybe bring down some of these midtones a little bit more. I want to try to get a little bit more color variation here between some of these shadows and some of the bright points. The one thing that's kind of nice is you'll actually notice that some of these changes actually get reflected right here in the viewport as we're making some of these exposure control settings. Right, so we can kind of get a little bit of a dual feedback. So let's maybe start to bring the contrast up a little bit higher. And again, maybe bring these midtones down a little bit more. Maybe strengthen some of this brightness. I'm just trying to bring a little bit more vibrance into this final image. Alright, and here's our final render. Now you might actually be getting, as you render this, some kind of an error message that says something to the effect of that the radiosity solution has actually been invalidated. Now that's probably due to the fact that this plant that we're using has a different subdivision level at render time than what it has here in the display. Now anytime that happens with a piece of geometry, what we get in the display obviously doesn't match what we see in the render, so obviously the radiosity solution that was calculated for the viewport is no longer valid. So that can sometimes be a problem, but in the case of this particular plant, it's really not a major issue. But if you do run into this problem with your own geometry, that's probably the culprit. You'll want to make sure that its division or its level of subdivision is actually the same in the viewport as what it is in the render. So you just select an object and take a look at the NURMS subdivision if that is what you're using, and just make sure that you're not using a separate checkbox for the render iterations. Alright, so that's a look at the radiosity and how we can use it to start to very quickly and very accurately simulate the effect of indirect light within our 3ds Max scenes.